Good morning, everybody. So glad that you could join us. I started this year as the presiding officer of the Faculty and Professional Staff Assembly in the School of Public Health. And I had the opportunity over the summer to go to a conference at SUNY Central for campus governance leaders. And at that conference, I had the pleasure of seeing Dr. K give this talk on Shared Governance 101, and I thought it would be great to open it up to more people to get the information. And this is especially good for people who are new to shared governance or maybe interested in participating in the future. So I'm really so delighted that Dr. K agreed to join us and share her insights. So a little bit about Dr. K. Dr. Gwen K is a professor of history at SUNY Oswego and president of the Faculty Senate. She joined the State University of New York Board of Trustees in July 2017. She's a member of Oswego's faculty since 2000, specializing in 20th century American history, particularly issues of medicine, science, and gender. Professor K also serves the academic community. She's the director of Oswego's honors program, served as coordinator of the history department's graduate program. She's on numerous campus and SUNY-wide committees, vice president and secretary of the University Faculty Senate. I don't know how you do both of those jobs. And additionally, she's treasurer for the History of Science Society. Professor K received her BA degree in biology and history from Bowdoin College and her PhD in history of medicine and science from Yale University. Really delighted to have Dr. K here. Welcome.
It is a pleasure to be here, so thank you to Elizabeth for inviting me. And I should clarify, I was vice president and secretary first for the Faculty Senate and then became the president. I don't do both at the same time. But I will make sure we clean up the website so that's obvious. This presentation on Shared Governance 101 was actually developed by my colleagues at the Faculty Council of Community Colleges, which is a parallel organization serving the faculty senates of the 30 community colleges in the SUNY system. But we have given it together many times, and I've adapted it. So I would like to do source attribution early and often in this case. So the first sort of basic question is, what is shared governance? And the best place to get the definition is actually from the AAUP's definitions. So I would refer you to the AAUP. They have a statement on shared governance from 1966. But when they're talking about shared governance, as you can see, they're talking about structures and processes, and I would emphasize the structures and processes part. And it's faculty and professional staff and administration and governing boards, and depending on the institution, students and staff participating in the development of policies and decision-making that affect the institution. Shared governance means by default, as I will expand on, the spaces in which faculty and staff are integrally involved. So there might be parts of the universe where there are decisions that are being made and faculty and staff and or students are not involved. Maybe we should be, but there are also spaces where we need to be involved because it affects what we do and how we do it. And when I say faculty, I always mean faculty and staff. So if I slip, every time I say faculty and staff as an air bubble over my head, because when I talk about shared governance, it is faculty and it is staff. I am aware that staff in many places are as, if not more important to the well-being of our students and the implementation of lots of our programs. And if staff are not on board, part of the decision-making process, supportive of what's happening in the academic mission, things will just not happen. The space where shared governance is most important and where people are talking about and thinking about shared governance is in the academic space. It's the space where faculty are best qualified and should have the primary role through an established governance structure. And that can always be a challenge. Different campuses have different policies. Every campus within the 34 state-operated campuses of SUNY has different structures, different policies, different inclusion about who's part of what, different committees. They might be similar, but they're not identical from campus to campus. So the spaces where faculty and staff should be at the forefront is making decisions about curriculum. If there is a new curriculum to be created, if there is a new curriculum that's going to be implemented, if changes need to be taking place because of governing and certification organizations' requirements, faculty need to be leading that charge. Similarly, methods of instruction. Being told that a certain course needs to be offered a certain way or a certain program needs to be run a certain way is contrary to shared governance. Good shared governance would ask that the methods of instruction are a discussion among faculty. And I can't speak for what happens here, but on my campus, I have colleagues who teach the exact same course I do, and we do it really differently. We use different books. We have different kinds of requirements. We have the same learning outcomes, but we have different ways of getting there. And we all think that our ways are good, and we talk among ourselves about what we're doing, and we take ideas from each other, and we expand. But it's very clear that we have different methods of instruction, and they're all equally good. Academic standards and rules need to be defined by faculty, not by administration telling faculty what to do. And I am aware that many people who are in academic administration started their lives out as faculty members. So people didn't suddenly become a department chair or a provost without knowing what it's like to be a faculty member, because their job is by nature very academic. But sometimes it helps to remind people about some of these things. Assessment of courses and programs needs to be done by faculty. There could be help from people in assessment. There could be help. But we all want to get to the same place, which is the best outcomes academically for our students, for our programs. We want our programs to be accredited in the spaces where they need to be accredited. We want our students to get the licensure that they need to get in the various programs and courses that they're in. That needs to be part of the faculty and staff purview. Also, academic affairs, program development, degree requirements. Before I had officially started as president, I was shadowing my predecessor for a month and a half. We were at a meeting of the chief academic officers of everyone in SUNY. And SUNY was just rolling out a heavy push to use open educational resources. It saves the students money, and there was an incentive program for campuses. If a campus had a section that used OER, the campus would get X amount of money from SUNY. And if the campus had every class within that course, every single section of something 101, using OER, they would get even more money. And one provost said, oh, I'm making my campus use OER for everything possible. And I looked and I said, you can't actually do that. That's method of instruction. That's how you're delivering the course material. That's up to the faculty members. You could talk with your faculty members about these open educational resources. Some of them might already be using them. You could explain to them why this might be something that they would prefer to do. You can't make that choice for them. That person wasn't very happy with what I said. And I also communicated with the campus governance leaders and the senators on that campus to give them a heads up, just so they knew as well. And they did end up using a lot of open educational resources, but by choice, not because their provost told them they had to do that. And yes, they had been very cost conscious and had been at the forefront of using open educational resources anyway, but they needed to make that choice, not be told by their provost that they were going to have to use open educational resources. So there are other places where shared governance gets interesting. Faculty should have input through a governance process, but they might not be areas that they're all germane to the academic enterprise, but they might not be as critical, or they're not totally academic related. And here, thinking about budget, mission, institutional assessment, searching for leaders in policy, on the one hand, having good bylaws helps. Having a leader who's willing to follow what the bylaws say is very helpful. Having someone who will listen is helpful. And things can go many different ways. I was on one campus, and they said every single one of these things is integral to the academic mission of our campus. Faculty governance must be involved in every single one of these pieces. And I thought, okay. Feels exhausting to me, but if you can do it, that's great. And they had argued that the budget affects the academic enterprise, and when there was a budget shortfall on their campus and programs are going to be frozen, they were not going to do hires, that affected the academic enterprise and they need to be part of those conversations. And I said, okay, so who on your campus is an economist who understands budgets, that could actually figure things out and understand the way that people in your budget office do? And the answer was no one. Which doesn't mean it wasn't important and they shouldn't have been concerned. And we'll get to what eventually happened. But part of it was having maybe some trust, but also keeping a watchful eye. So they let their president know that they were keeping a watchful eye on the budget and tracking some of these things as they developed. What this could mean is that your campus does a search for, a new CFO, as my campus is. Our chief financial officer has said he was going to retire 3 times and has not, because he's been begged by the president to not leave. But I think he actually really is retiring this time. Faculty governance on Oswego's campus is not directly involved in that search. It's not an academic space. It's nothing we have in our bylaws. But the president and the provost had informed the executive committee early about this person's planned retirement, again and again and again. And for running the search, they tried to get faculty involved in the search. And they didn't necessarily do it through a shared governance process the way you might looking for a dean or a provost, but they made sure that faculty widely talked about it. It was talked about many times in shared governance spaces to try to encourage faculty to get involved and pay attention. And when candidates came on campus for the position, they're open to everybody on campus. People didn't throng. It's not a dean or a provost, but people definitely were paying attention. The people who really cared showed up to each of these meetings and were very involved. So there are ways you can try to be involved in a shared governance space, even in places that might not inherently seem like they're critical to shared governance. So faculty purview over the curriculum is perhaps the most important place where shared governance is and should be. I would argue that the reasons are obvious, and yet on many campuses they're not. So sometimes it's helpful to remind other people that programs, learning outcomes are things that faculty need to think about. Sequencing of content, sometimes it's fairly obvious. Sometimes it doesn't matter as much. But faculty and staff know that more than someone outside of your space would know that. And this is a space where faculty governance needs to be clear about what's happening. When new programs are developed, and if you've developed a new program, you know this, they go through faculty governance on campus and through all the appropriate processes here. Then they get sent to Albany, and they go through more review at Albany. And they get sent out to all the other campuses just as a notification and a heads up, so that if a new program were going to be developed in something that you were the only school in the entire system that did it, and the new school were very close by, you could argue correctly that there's not enough need and you have all the staffing requirements and there's nothing that could be gained by expanding to this other school. The hope is that this has all gone through governance. To make sure that that happens, one of the things that the Faculty Senate does is forwards an email every week with all of the new programs that have been proposed out to the campus governance leaders. And the hope is that if a campus leader sees a program with their school's name on it, and they haven't actually seen it before, this would be a problem if they would flag it and say, this hasn't actually gone through the shared governance process. That's a problem. Or if it has gone through the shared governance process and we think it's going to be a problem, it's competing with us, it's a program that we can barely get enough students for, and we don't need a second or third one in the state, speaking up will help with the evolution of that process. So the Faculty Senate's trying to build on top, sort of a supra level of help on top of what we hope is already happening on campuses, especially developing courses and programs as they evolve. There is definitely a space for students in shared governance. Their concerns tend to be very different than those of faculty. And there's an irony in that students are the reason we are here doing what we do, and yet they're also the people who are here the least amount of time. Hopefully, they do what they need to do and they graduate. And they may stay here and work, and that's fantastic. And if they go elsewhere, that's great too. But students have a space in shared governance. They should be involved in some things like searches, especially for positions like dean or provost. Student affairs issues should much more be dependent on students than faculty and staff. Recognizing that here it's different because you have students who are here for varying lengths of times and different programs aren't all spending a lot of their time here as they're doing all that they need to do to get all the training that they need. But there is absolutely a space for students. And I should point out that in the SUNY hierarchy, the student trustee, the student president, the president of the student assembly, is on the Board of Trustees and has a vote. The president of the Faculty Council of Community Colleges is on the Board of Trustees by virtue of her job, does not have a vote. I am the president of the Faculty Senate, and as you heard from Elizabeth, I am on the SUNY Board of Trustees by virtue of my position, and I do not have a vote. So I'm not saying we should be nice to students just to get power, but students should be involved in processes and discussions when we have them because they often have insights and ideas that we don't have. And often also on college councils, it turns out, student representatives have votes where faculty do not. I don't know if that's true here. It's true on many campuses within SUNY. One of the critical things about shared governance is thinking about policymaking versus procedure. I have to confess, I have become a policy and process person in ways that I had not ever anticipated I would. It started when I was on my own campus trying to change the bylaws. And I say this only because this has happened on at least 4 other campuses that I have visited, which is we had trouble making quorum because some departments had lots of seats and some departments had few seats, but the departments that had lots of seats didn't always actually have lots of faculty physically present. We couldn't make quorum, we couldn't pass things, we couldn't vote. We wanted to change the bylaws so we could have a working body, but we had to actually get all of the people who usually didn't come to come so we could actually change the bylaws because you have a higher standard for changing your bylaws in terms of quorum. We needed 2/3. And I have been on 4 campuses this past fall, who have been in the same situation, changing their bylaws because people aren't coming, but needing to get the quorum to be able to change the bylaws. So that made me think about process and policy a lot more. The challenge with governance is our work isn't operational. Our job isn't to get into the weeds. Our job is to think about policy and let someone else work out how it's actually going to happen. And you might be unique, but on my campus, there's a person who raises their hand every single time we're talking about something. And as soon as this person's hand goes up, accept that 50% of the time, they are 100% correct in what they're saying. And they've caught something, because this person does get weedy. They catch something that actually is going to have consequences that we hadn't thought about. Now, the other 50% of the time, I think they're talking just to talk, hence the eye rolls. But we have to pay attention because 50% of the time, they're actually contributing things. And you need a person with that great attention to detail. It's made me temper my eye roll every time this person raises their hand. But we need to think we're not about being operational. Leave that to somebody else. But this is part of why shared governance is shared governance. If you're thinking about policy, curriculum, whatever, this is why you want all faculty and staff involved in that process. This is why you want people in administration who might be implementing that policy to be part of that discussion, to be on the committee that's making that having that discussion, to be ex officio or voting, so that they are not surprised when a change happens and they can think of all the reasons why it might or might not work. So this is the sharing part of shared governance as well. And this is all the ideal, not what really happens. The biggest challenge is this, that the occasional feedback or consultation happens. It shouldn't be the norm. When we're making decisions as faculty and staff in a shared governance process about something, it's very helpful to actually listen to all of the information coming in, even if we don't follow it, just to hear all the concerns that people might have. Similarly, it's helpful if the administration listen to the feedback and consultation they're getting and then not go ahead anyway with the decision they've already made. If you do that too often, you ruin all the trust that you might have in terms of actually being able to make effective decisions. You need to collaborate. There is a critical difference between governance and unions. It gets murky, it gets mucky. There are definitely places where there is overlap. What I will say is that governance really should be about academic matters, curriculum, pedagogy, assessment. The union should be dealing with more things like economic matters, working conditions. There are clearly places of overlap. Tenure and promotion is a governance issue, but it's also a union issue. Sabbaticals are both. So there are places where there is overlap, and the challenge is to make clear what those spaces and places are. You might be unique on this campus. On many campuses, I know that many people who are active in shared governance are also active in the unions. Or many people who are active in the unions are also active in shared governance. How do I know this? I go to the UUP meetings. And I sit in on committees like the Health Concerns Committee, which is an interesting evolving space at the moment at UUP. And I look around, and I see a lot of faces that I recognize from shared governance, which is good, but it's also important to remember where the differences in the spaces might be. So right now, UUP is looking at SUNY Online and online education and online higher ed. It has impacts on, it's very much about course development, creation, methods of instruction, delivery. It's also about workload, and will it be counted as part of or in addition to, how will it be compensated? So it's very much in both spaces. UUP has a task force looking at that issue right now. UFS, University Faculty Senate, has a group that's thinking about and looking at parts of that right now also. And University Faculty Senate was asked by the provost to put a few representatives on the provost's online advisory committee. And we did. And we put on people who are on campuses that are part of the online pilot, but also people who are doing it. And several names that were sent to me were people who are also on the UUP's committee. And I thought, that's great. We don't need one person to be on both committees necessarily, because that might muddy the waters, and there are some differences in terms of space. It helps, therefore, to have good relationships with union leadership so that when there are questions that overlap, and there are many, we can have frank conversations about what works and what doesn't. The president of UUP has called me and asked me questions. God bless you. I have called him and I've asked him questions. When we have had resolutions that I think might impact UUP, I've let him know in advance. So the Faculty Senate passed a resolution last year at the instigation of staff who are members of Faculty Senate that professional staff be allowed and encouraged to participate in shared governance. I, as a faculty member, can go to a meeting because I don't have class and I have let people know I'm not going to be in office hours and I have great flexibility. I don't have to ask my boss, the way I would if I were a staff member, for permission to go to a meeting. So we passed a resolution and we talked in advance with UUP about this resolution. They're still not happy. They still think we're encroaching on their space, and that's okay. But we had talked to them before we passed the resolution so they would know what we were thinking about in terms of work and economic matters. one of my favorite slides, all about process. The more complex you are, the more you need to figure out how your governing bodies interact with each other. How do each of the school representatives and the school governing bodies interact with the university-wide? How do the students interact with student governance, interact with you? How does the union interact with you? And vice versa. So no one has ever said we've talked too much about this. I wish we weren't. I mean, people might get tired of the conversation, but every time there's been a breakdown, it's because there's a lack of good communication. So if you have clear relationships talking with other people, that might be helpful. But also, committees need to report to the larger body. The larger body needs to report out, and members and senators need to report back to their constituents. I know this only happens on my campus, but there have been discussions that have been happening in governance for a semester or 2 or 3. And we've been talking about them, and then we'll come up for vote, and there might be a university-wide email about it, and people say, I never knew about that. Well, maybe your senator hasn't been reporting back. Maybe your department representative hasn't been doing what they should have been doing. Maybe the person in your department who's chairing that committee has not talked to anybody about what's actually been happening. I know this only happens at Oswego. But committee members need to talk to the larger body. The larger body needs to communicate out, and then people need to go back to their constituents and report back, and the constituents also should give feedback. So when there is a vote on something, the person voting is cognizant that they're voting not for themselves, but for the constituents that they represent. Because that's not always the same. And I've heard people give passionate arguments, and they'll be very clear that this isn't what they personally would do, but it's what their department wants them to do. But that's appropriate because they're there as the representative of their department. Their department discussed it, voted, majority won. That's what they're going to advocate. There are lots of places where shared governance goes wrong. Lots and lots and lots. So one of them, of course, is when there's silence. And sometimes silence is interpreted as consent rather than very unhappy and too busy to respond, or can't civilly respond yet, so I'm waiting. Which means that it's really helpful to ask people what they think, so you don't just get silence. There is a confusion of roles. People aren't always clear what they're doing or in what capacity. Last night, my husband said, are you going as a trustee or are you going as president of the Faculty Senate? And I said, I'm going as president of the Faculty Senate. But the president might want to talk to me in my role as trustee. So I might morph at 2 o'clock into a trustee. And apparently I also got a primo parking space reserved outside, which might have been because I was a trustee also. And I took the subway, so it didn't matter. But keeping track of that role, and it's also because we have many hats as faculty and staff. We interact with students, and we interact with staff, and we interact with faculty, and we do lots of different things. And we might become department chair, and then we have a different level of interaction and a different level of responsibility. And then we might become an assistant dean or an associate dean or a provost. And so things keep on changing, and we need to be cognizant of where we are in that. Which leads to not paying attention to recommendations from faculty. If we're not getting silence and we are getting recommendations back from faculty, even if the recommendation isn't followed, God bless you. This is the sneezy side over there. Even if we aren't following recommendations, it's helpful to know why. I'm going in a different direction because I don't want to get a cold, so I'm going to go over here, not over there. So, and this is hard because sometimes there are reasons we can't actually talk about. Sometimes there are reasons we can talk about, but we might not want to. But when faculty give recommendations and they're not followed or they're rejected by administration, it's helpful if administration could explain why. That's the sharing part. Similarly, if faculty get a suggestion or recommendation from administration and choose to not follow or have objections, it's helpful to explain why as well. Although it's harder for us as faculty to reject the suggestions from administration. Which leads to this watchdog mentality. If shared governance goes wrong, it's because every side is watching everybody else to make a mistake, to do something wrong, to catch them on it, to call them on it. And sometimes people really do make big, huge mistakes that are really wrong, and we should call them on it. We all do make mistakes, not intentionally. But if everyone has this watchdog mentality and everyone's watching very carefully, we're going to have poor communication because no one's really going to want to talk, because when you do really talk, you might say things, and you might say things that then might be used in a different way. Having said that, this is being recorded. I'm not going to say that. You can ask me later off camera. There are more ways to go wrong, like way, way, way more ways. Faculty getting into the weeds, or administrators going into academic policy without sort of capitalizing or capturing the other people. People who are really happy to have power because they just want the power. My very first job at an institution that shall remain nameless, the department chair was department chair because they really wanted to be department chair. And I had grown up in a household where my father had done everything possible to never have to be department chair. And I had heard for years about academic politics. And the person who was chair loved being chair. And everyone else let this person be chair because they'd done it at least once or twice, but this person just so wanted to be chair. Wasn't very good, made lots of mistakes, just wanted the power of being chair, which should have been a clue. There's also sometimes a lack of understanding the representative function and what it entails. Disengaged faculty or students can happen because there's not a lot of discussion. An inability or unwillingness to recognize and respect the work that comes out of shared governance committees. When you have a long, thoughtful discussion, you have a final document. And hopefully there have been representatives from administration party to the process or invited to be party to the process, whether or not they choose to actually show up. That process should be respected. And if it's not, go back to you need to explain why you're not going to follow those recommendations, having had this long, thoughtful process. Making decisions behind closed doors, also never really good. Oh, and one more bad shared governance. When people in administration talk to a faculty member, and they use that faculty member as proxy for shared governance faculty, that's a mistake. So if the president were walking down the hall and pulled Lori over and said, "What do you think about this?" And Lori's thinking, "I'm just a faculty member. I'm not talking on behalf of shared governance. I'm not talking as the chair of the SUNY University Faculty Senate Operations Committee. I'm just giving my personal opinion." And later, President Riley says, "Well, I've talked to faculty and they think it's a great idea." A random or not so random faculty member, not talking to Nick, not talking to Elizabeth as chairs of their faculty governance spaces, not saying, as a shared governance leader, what do you think about this? That's a mistake. So we have our indicators for good shared governance. Trust and transparency. If that doesn't exist, nothing else will matter. If you don't trust the person you're talking to, it doesn't matter what you say or what they say. Go back to watchdog mentality. If there's been a mistake, can you build or rebuild trust? You can. It's hard. It takes a long time. Transparency. Different things are transparent on different campuses. Different administrations feel comfortable being transparent about different kinds of information. On one campus, the entire faculty has complete access to the entire budget. Now, it's not as complicated as your budget. Let's start with that. But the entire faculty and staff, everybody, has access to the entire budget. So when the president says, we're having financial problems, people can compare this year's budget to last year's budget and see what's gone up in deficit space and what's gone down in enrollment and understand some of that. On other campuses, the transparency about the budget is we spent this percentage of our budget on academic affairs, this percent on student affairs. That's as transparent as I will be. So it's very different from campus to campus. But the more transparent, the better on both sides. Institutional communication, the more communication, the better. Because you don't want that person to say, I've only heard now after 3 semesters of discussion about this issue. The more that administration can be communicating with faculty and staff, the more that faculty and staff can be communicating with administration, the better. And yet, everybody needs to understand their collective space. So the board needs to understand what their role is in relationship to shared governance. The president needs to understand what their role is in relation to shared governance. The faculty need to understand what their role is in relationship to shared governance. Those pieces working well will help. Understanding the responsibilities of representation, that people take information and report back, report their constituent concerns forward, is often very helpful. Someone recently said, faculty, especially in terms of certain things on their campus, are the canaries in the coal mine. They have hit every major problem before a semester or 2 before administration has realized it's a problem. Because they're interacting with students, they're asking questions, they're hearing different things. And when that campus has been good, it's because people have said, you know, I'm having this problem with X. And it turns out it's not just one person, it's lots of people. They've been able to resolve it. When things haven't worked out so well, that person hasn't spoken up or they've been ignored. And then a couple semesters later, when it's suddenly a big problem, all the faculty and staff are saying, yeah, we knew that. This isn't anything brand new. Joint decision making is very helpful, and having processes in place to assess structural arrangements for governance, i.e. looking at your bylaws and changing them when need be, which I know is in process right now. Now, I said this and I've gotten in trouble, but a definition of pornography, according to Justice of the Supreme Court, is you know it when you see it. It's Justice Potter Stewart. That's what he said. You can read the decision. So good shared governance is really hard. You know it when you see it. But it's often really hard to define what's working well. We know when it's not working well. We can figure that out. When shared governance is working well, it's often really hard to find things. What I would say is that communication is the key. When you have good communication, you have better shared governance. When you have bad communication or no communication, you tend to have bad shared governance. And with that, I'll stop and answer any questions if there are any. Uh-oh, okay.
So as a historian, I'm not a historian, and I'm seeing more of these kinds of presentations and more interest in faculty governance in the last 5 years or so than I had in the previous 30-some years. I'm on a committee that we call the assessment committee. And so I'm wondering, to use assessment as a specific example, are you seeing this division between administration and faculty being wide, faculty roles shrinking where they need faculty governance? And assessment would be a great way, in my opinion, to basically say, well, these are the things we need to be able to accomplish. So I'm not interested so much in what you think is important in the classroom. I need these metrics hit in order for our accreditation to go through. So my question is, are you seeing assessment as a tool for either the faculty or the administration, rather than a general bean counting of academics, as an additional step toward this gap between faculty and campus administration?
All right, I'm going to answer this in an interesting way. I think that part of the attention to shared governance in the last 5 years or so especially is post-recession, when a lot of campuses were reeling, many campuses were in deep financial trouble. And so decisions were made, maybe because they had to be, but people who should have been part of the process weren't. And that led to an uptick in, oh, we have the shared governance body, we should be part of that process, we should have been part of that discussion. So I think some of the interest in shared governance is a little bit of catch up. I also think that assessment on campuses is happening being driven by accreditation. That to be reaccredited with any institution, they want assessment. And someone just argued we're not closing the loop, we're continually improving, so it should be a spiral, not a loop. I have had learning outcomes on my syllabus for as long as I've been teaching. Everyone I know has. We didn't necessarily call them learning outcomes, but they were there, right? Students should learn this, 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 and this by the end of the class. Now we have to be very clear about them, and we have to assess them. And I think this is absolutely being driven by all of the accreditation that we need to do. And the response by many administrations has been to hire somebody or several somebodies just to do assessment. If we're lucky, they're coming out of faculty. If we're not lucky, they're not. And this is nothing against people who are assessment gurus not ever having taught. I have many friends who do this. But I think that they have a different perspective. And I think that they are so focused on just their outcomes that they're not paying attention to the larger processes. And on some campuses, it's now working backwards. We need to accomplish this, this, and this. The curriculum, therefore, has to have this, this, and this. Therefore, all new courses have to have this, this, and this, instead of working with the curriculum committee on every department to make sure that all these things happen. And I think that we all do want to improve. Assessment done right is very helpful, it's very good, it benefits our students, we become better at what we do, but it is not always done in the right way. And what's happening on most campuses is that the part of the budget going to academic affairs is getting smaller because more resource, I mean, we still have a lot of money in academic affairs. It's the biggest chunk of the pie. But more resources are now being expended on student affairs than ever before because we're offering the supports that we should have been offering for a long time, but we're now offering more supports. We're now offering, we need to have this like assessment person or people. So there are other people that are taking up valuable space and valuable resources doing what absolutely needs to be done. But sometimes it seems like it's an us versus them mentality as well, which doesn't really help if you're a person who does assessment and people worry, correctly or not, that you're going to tilt and drive the process rather than work collaboratively to have the process improve. That was a really long answer.
One of your slides had the line stating as a problem disengagement. Do you have any advice or ideas about how that
If I did, I could make a lot of money. I think what tends to happen, what I've seen happen most is that you have a person or a couple people in a department or a school or a space who are really passionate, which is wonderful and it benefits their colleagues, but it comes at the expense of them burning out, and it comes at the expense of nobody else thinking they need to step up to do it. And so sometimes it's just saying, could you sit on this committee? Like a baby step in. Or I'm going to I have a research project next year that's going to take me off campus for the fall. Could you do this in my place? But despite the fact that service counts for tenure and promotion, it tends to not count as much, shall we say? And so it's a lot of time that people are expending that might not be seen as productive or valuable as improving your teaching, getting that grant, running your lab. And so it's very, seeing this many patients in your clinic. So it becomes a challenge to get people involved. And I mean, the worst case is if something goes wrong and somebody wants to get involved to correct an error, happy that they're involved, but not happy that something had to be so dire as to get people involved in shared governance. But I have not been to any campus yet where they said, we have so many people running. We have more people than we know what to do with. You want to help in shared governance. So even on the campuses where we think, oh, they don't have a research portfolio and agenda the way you do, they're still having the same problems because they have a heavy teaching load, like 5.5 or 6.6 of 15 contact hours a week. So they're wrestling with the same issues. But if you find a magic answer, please let me know.
I'd like to make a comment. I used to sort of be a little sort of upset that sometimes administration would appoint somebody to a committee, they may be faculty or professional staff, and then afterwards we'd say, well, where's the faculty governance representation? And they'd say, well, we have faculty on this committee.
Yep.
It's not the same thing as having an elected member of
Yep.
shared governance on the committee. However, I've come to think about this as not 100% fault of the administration, because you need to have good participation by the faculty so that the elected members show up to the body, and then they would have numerous people to choose from to populate these committees. And fortunately, I think we're starting to be in a position here at Downstate where we manage to get a quorum most of the time. People are showing up, and in fact, in our last election for presiding officer elect, I think we had something like 6 or 7 people run.
Wow.
So, and that was, I've never seen that before. So, it's a chicken and egg situation, but when people start to show interest in being on these shared governance committees, then we can start saying, well, these committees should be populated with elected people rather than appointed.
Sometimes it's helpful to take advantage of a mistake, shall we say, in putting faculty on instead of going through a shared governance process. I had to send the provost of SUNY a lovely email, and I said, we're putting together this committee. Actually, it was the SUNY Online Advisory Task Force, which the Faculty Council of Community Colleges has been asking about for a year and a half. And they passed a resolution last spring, and they passed one this fall, and we passed a resolution, we endorsed their resolution asking that faculty and staff be involved in the SUNY online process and have an advisory group that has faculty on it as well. And I, God bless you, got an email with the list of who was on the committee, and they were faculty from state-operated campuses, not faculty that shared governance had anything to do with. And I could figure out how some people got put on the committee. So I sent an email to the provost and said, I appreciate that there are faculty slots on this committee. Could we go through a shared governance process and have faculty and staff on that from a shared governance space? And luckily for me, he said, sure. And I thought, I have no idea who should be on this committee. So I did what I do, which is I sent an email to campus governance leaders like Nick and said, can you recommend people for this committee? And some people responded and said yes, and some people didn't. I did not interpret silence as consent. I interpreted it as either no one's on my committee or I'm really busy, and some people got back to me a week or two later. You did. Nick always responds, just for the record. But it was a hard conversation to have because the provost thought he was doing something good by having spaces for faculty from the state-operated campuses and faculty from the community colleges. But the president of the Faculty Council of Community Colleges and I had a slightly different opinion. So there is this challenge when someone is appointed and you're not sure how they got there, or you know and you're not really happy with that. And sometimes the answer is ask and you'll get nothing. Sometimes the answer is ask and you can maybe get another person added to the committee, which isn't the worst thing in the world. But it's a hard balance to find.
So you said something that made me sad. You said, luckily for you, the provost agreed. That's as good as it gets. Luckily.
So at the end of the day, the problem is that shared governance, we are an advisory body only. So yes, if the provost had said no, I would have voiced my displeasure to the provost and to the chancellor, and I would have been talking about it a lot at the fall plenary and the winter plenary and every plenary thereafter. But yes, luckily, which is the problem. So at the end of the day, we can make recommendations for anything and everything. We can't make them actually happen. We can make recommendations about policy that the president can choose to not make happen. So yes, we've passed resolutions that the chancellor has decided aren't going to happen. So yes, luckily, and that's the hard part. So now you have people involved, and you have people committed, and you get something done, and then nothing. So yeah. Anything else? Well, thank you all for giving up your first morning back after maybe vacation.